During the Spanish-American War, African Americans had fought next to whites and were beginning to use their skills and newfound freedom to become respected, productive members in society. They had begun to hold positions of power and various jobs previously held by whites only. However, many white people of the time did not see the equality as a good sign and became alarmed. In Wilmington, African Americans made up a significant portion of the population, and they were the majority of the voting population. Since African Americans held many positions of power, the white population was afraid that they were losing their grip on the power in the city. This spurred the beginning of the Party of White Supremacy, which argued that the Democratic Party could save the people from Negro rule. To help restore the power, Frenfold Simmons, Josephus Daniels, and Charles Aycock designed a campaign portraying white women endangered by the African American men in office. This also brought to surface another sensitive issue of interracial couples involving an African American woman and a white man, and how it was considered inappropriate. Voting became a controversial topic because whites were threatening African Americans and discouraging them from voting, and African American women were threatening African American men if they did not vote. Despite many African American men turning out for the vote, all of the African American candidates were outvoted. However, this was not good enough for the people of Wilmington, and they drove the African American officials out of office. While the African American officials were targeted, no one was safe, and a massacre took place in the streets of Wilmington. Despite begging for help from the White House, President McKinley stayed out of the issue. Once the African American population had been removed from office and run out of town, the ads turned to promoting the segregation of everything: transportation, restrooms, schools, essentially all public areas. However, some people saw the Jim Crow laws as an obstacle to be overcome. One such person was Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She returned to North Carolina to teach, and she opened up her own school. Receiving funding was difficult, but she had the girls write letters home telling patrons what they were learning and requesting financial support. While the school appeared to be vocational on the outside, the school also focused on developing well-rounded individuals. She worked to teach the girls that they could be as good as anyone else, regardless of the color of their skin. Within her school, she tried to shelter her students from the racism that surrounded them. While Brown tried to protect her children, many others were unfortunate and were given long, unfair punishments for petty crimes, and often forced to serve on chain gangs. A convict leasing program was started by which landowners or anyone who needed laborers could pay the state for the convicts to come do the labor. It was almost the same thing as slavery, but under a different and crueler set of circumstances. Since the laborers were now seen as convicts, their lives meant even less, and they were treated with unprecedented brutality. They were often treated like animals, kept in cages, beaten, underfed, and forced to work in some of the most inhospitable conditions. In fact, to keep up with demands, ridiculous sentences were passed. While a white male may only get 90 days in jail for petty theft, an African American man would get 2 years on the convict lease program. Even children were being charged harshly. Even though they were being subjected to a form of slavery that made it impossible to live without fear, they were able to come together. Their music and religion helped them unite and find solid ground in the face of uncertainty. In the early 1900s, New Orleans was considered a very liberal city. However, in the 1890s, Jim Crow came to New Orleans. One monumental case was Plessy versus Ferguson. Omar Plessy appeared to be Caucasian. On the train, he was not considered African American until he identified himself as such. After that, he was told to either relocate to the correct seating area or get off the train. In 1896, the case Plessy versus Ferguson allowed for the legalization of segregation under the terms that the accommodations be separate but equal. This law allowed each state to make their laws accordingly. 2 years later, another law allowed states to disqualify African Americans from voting. This caused a severe drop in the African American voters, especially in Louisiana, where they dropped from 130,000 to just 5,000 votes. As their rights and liberties were being stripped away, African Americans found a great means of expression through music. Jazz music changed the way music was written and performed. It challenged and broke down the barriers between African Americans and white communities, and the notion that African American people were inferior. Historically, African Americans had wrongly been identified as inferior and savage. Racism and ignorant fear made people blind to African Americans' talents, education, and skills. This fear was amplified through images and advertising.